Captain Jake Morrison stared out at the massive structure floating in the void before him. The Grand Nexus station stretched for kilometers in every direction, its gleaming surfaces reflecting the light of the nearby star Kepler 442. After 3 months of hyperspace travel aboard the Starship Liberty, they had finally arrived at humanity's first formal diplomatic meeting with the Galactic Trade Consortium. "It's beautiful," whispered Dr. Amy Clark from her position at the observation deck. The xenobiologist had spent most of the journey studying every piece of data Earth had collected about the 12 species that made up the consortium. Now she would finally meet them face to face. Chief Negotiator Linda Hayes checked her datapad for the 100th time. The agricultural trade agreements she had prepared represented months of work by Earth's best economists and farmers.
Humanity needed these trade routes to support their growing colonies,
and Earth's unique crops could provide valuable nutrition to alien worlds. "Remember, everyone," Morrison said as he turned from the window. "This is humanity's big chance. We've been watched and evaluated for 50 years. They've decided we're ready to join their club. Let's not mess this up." Colonel Ben Parker adjusted his dress uniform and nodded. As the military advisor, he understood the strategic importance of this mission. The consortium controlled the major shipping lanes and trade routes throughout this sector of the galaxy. Without their approval, human expansion would be severely limited. The Liberty docked at one of the station's many bays with surprising ease. The docking systems were advanced beyond anything humanity had developed, smoothly guiding their ship into position without any input from the crew. Within minutes, they received a formal greeting from the station's automated systems in perfect English. "Welcome, human delegation, to Grand Nexus Station. Please proceed to Diplomatic Bay 7 for processing and orientation. Estimated processing time is 4 standard days." Morrison frowned at that last part. 4 days just for processing seemed excessive, but he reminded himself that alien bureaucracy might work differently than human systems. He led his small team through the airlock and into the station proper. The corridors of the Nexus were unlike anything they had ever seen. The walls seemed to pulse with soft light, and the air carried unfamiliar but pleasant scents. Beings of various species moved through the halls with unhurried steps. Morrison spotted his first Zephyrian, tall and elegant with blue-tinted skin and flowing robes. The alien moved with grace but seemed to be in no particular hurry to get anywhere. At the diplomatic bay, they met their first official contact. Administrator Velnin, a crystalline being whose body reflected light in rainbow patterns, greeted them with what might have been a smile. It was hard to tell with the Veltar species since their faces were made of living crystal. "Honored humans, welcome to our facility. I trust your journey was satisfactory. Please provide all documentation for preliminary review. This should take approximately 72 hours. Linda Hayes stepped forward with her carefully prepared files. "I have everything here. Trade agreements, cultural exchange protocols, and formal applications for membership consideration." Velnin's crystal face somehow managed to look surprised. "Oh my, you have brought actual proposals. How refreshing. Most new species require several years of observation and discussion before attempting to submit formal documentation. We shall need to convene a special committee to determine the proper procedures for reviewing premature submissions." Morrison felt his first hint of concern. "Premature? We were invited to these talks." "Indeed you were," Velnin replied with what sounded like patience. "However, the invitation was for preliminary discussions about the possibility of future consideration for potential membership evaluation. The actual submission of formal documents typically occurs much later in the process." Dr. Clark exchanged glances with Colonel Parker. This was not what they had expected based on the consortium's initial communications with Earth. Over the next several hours, the humans were given a tour of the diplomatic facilities. They met representatives from several member species, each more polite and accommodating than the last. The insectoid Korthak delegates clicked their mandibles in what their translator indicated was a greeting. The gas-based ethereal spoke through crystalline communication devices that filled the air with melodious tones. But something bothered Morrison about every interaction. No one seemed to be in charge of anything specific, and every question was met with references to committees, subcommittees, and review boards. When he asked about timeline for trade negotiations, he was told that the Preliminary Trade Evaluation Committee would need to form a subcommittee to assess the formation of a working group to discuss potential timelines. Their quarters were luxurious and comfortable, With adjustable atmosphere and gravity controls to accommodate human physiology, the food dispensers provided excellent meals based on Earth cuisine databases. But despite the comfort, Morrison felt increasingly uneasy. On their second day, Linda Hayes attempted to present her agricultural proposals to the Trade Committee. She found herself in a vast chamber filled with representatives from all 12 member species, each seated at elaborate stations equipped with translation systems and data networks. The setup was impressive and clearly designed for serious negotiations. Honored delegates, Linda began, Earth offers a variety of unique agricultural products that could benefit many of your worlds. Our grains are highly nutritious and grow in diverse climates. Our fruits provide essential vitamins that some of your species require but cannot synthesize naturally. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Questions flooded from every direction, but not about the products themselves. Instead, the delegates wanted to know about the philosophical implications of cross-species nutrition, the long-term cultural effects of dietary changes, and the environmental impact of introducing foreign agriculture to established ecosystems. Hours passed with Linda trying to answer increasingly abstract questions, while her practical proposals were pushed aside. When she finally asked when they might discuss actual trade terms, primary mediator Kelthara of the Zephyrians explained that they would first need to complete a comprehensive impact study, which typically required 18 to 24 months. But we've already completed impact studies, Linda protested. We have full environmental assessments and nutritional analyses for every product we're offering. Ah, said Kelthara with what seemed like gentle condescension. But those were Earth-based studies. We must conduct our own evaluations using consortium standards and methodologies. The Committee for Agricultural Assessment Standards will need to review your methodologies before we can begin our assessment of your assessments. Colonel Parker spent his time observing the military briefings he had been invited to attend. What he found disturbed him even more than the trade negotiations. The consortium maintained a substantial fleet for security purposes, but they seemed incapable of using it effectively. A report came in about space pirates attacking a merchant convoy in the Altair system. The pirates, calling themselves the Crimson Fleet, had been operating in consortium space for months. Parker watched as the Security Council spent hours debating the proper response protocols while the attack was actually happening. Should we not send ships to help them immediately? Parker asked during a brief recess. Fleet Commander Thexol of the Korthak looked genuinely shocked at the suggestion. We cannot simply dispatch military vessels without proper authorization. The Emergency Response Committee must first evaluate the threat level, determine appropriate force levels, and submit recommendations to the full Security Council for approval. How long does that process take? Parker pressed. Typically 6 to 8 days for emergency situations, Thexol replied proudly. We have streamlined the process significantly in recent years. It used to take 2 weeks. By the time Parker returned to his quarters that evening, news feeds confirmed that the merchant convoy had been destroyed and its crew captured. The Emergency Response Committee was still reviewing the initial threat assessment. Dr. Clark made the most disturbing discovery of all during her meetings with the consortium's scientific council. Despite having access to incredible technologies and vast resources, their scientific advancement had nearly ground to a halt. Research projects that should have taken months were stretched across decades as scientists waited for approval from ethics committees, environmental boards, and cultural impact assessors. We have identified a cure for the Rigelian plague that has been affecting Outer Rim colonies, explained Dr. Xanthara, a Veltar scientist whose crystal structure pulsed with frustrated energy. However, the Medical Ethics Review Board is still evaluating whether introducing human-derived compounds into alien physiology raises concerns about biological imperialism. People are dying, Clark said flatly, indeed regrettably so. But we must ensure that our cure does not create unforeseen cultural disruptions or dependency relationships. The review process typically takes 3 to 5 years for xenobiological treatments. Clark stared at the alien scientist in disbelief. 3 to 5 years? How many will die while you're reviewing? That is indeed unfortunate, but proper procedures must be followed. We learned long ago that hasty actions are... The weeks that followed confirmed Morrison's worst fears about the consortium. Each passing day brought new examples of how thoroughly the organization had trapped itself in layers of bureaucracy that prevented any meaningful action. The human delegation found themselves caught in an endless maze of committees, subcommittees, and review boards that seemed designed to delay rather than accomplish anything. Linda Hayes had spent 3 weeks trying to arrange a simple medical supply trade for Earth's expanding colonies. The Outer Rim settlements desperately needed basic antibiotics and surgical equipment, while Earth could provide rare minerals that several consortium worlds required for their manufacturing processes. It should have been a straightforward exchange that benefited everyone involved. Instead, Linda found herself sitting through her 15th meeting about the philosophical implications of medical intervention across species boundaries. The Committee for Interspecies Health Ethics had formed a subcommittee to examine whether providing human-manufactured antibiotics to alien colonists might create unhealthy dependency relationships. We must consider the long-term cultural effects, explained Committee Chair Yelmora, a tall Zephyrian whose blue skin seemed to pulse with earnest concern. What if these colonies begin to rely too heavily on human medical technology? Could this create an imbalance in the natural development of their societies? Linda struggled to keep her voice calm. People are getting sick and dying while we discuss philosophy. These are basic medical supplies, not advanced technology transfers. But that distinction itself requires careful evaluation, replied another committee member, a crystalline Veltar whose light patterns flickered with what might have been excitement at the complexity of the issue. The Committee for Technology Classification Standards has not yet determined where basic medical supplies fit within the established framework of intervention protocols. The meeting continued for 6 more hours, ending only when it was time for the regularly scheduled break to allow committee members to attend their other committee meetings. Linda walked back to her quarters feeling like she was trapped in some kind of bureaucratic nightmare where talking about problems had completely replaced solving them. Colonel Parker was discovering equally disturbing patterns in his military briefings. The Crimson Fleet pirates had grown bolder since their successful attack on the merchant convoy, launching raids throughout consortium space while the Security Council continued to debate appropriate response measures. We have confirmation of 17 separate attacks in the past 2 weeks, reported Fleet Commander Thexel during the daily security briefing. The pirates appeared to be targeting medical supply convoys and food shipments to vulnerable colonies. Parker leaned forward in his chair. Do we know their base of operations? Can we track their movement patterns? Oh yes, we have extensive intelligence on their activities, Thexel replied with what seemed like pride. The Intelligence Analysis Committee has prepared detailed reports on their tactics, capabilities, and likely next targets. Then why haven't we moved against them? Parker asked, though he already suspected the answer. The Military Action Authorization Board is still reviewing the intelligence reports, explained another officer, a gas-based ethereal whose translated voice carried tones of infinite patience. They must first determine whether the threat level justifies active military intervention under Protocol 7 Alpha 12. Parker felt his jaw clench. How long does this authorization process take? For piracy situations, typically 4 to 6 weeks, Thexel answered cheerfully. Though if the board determines that additional consultation is required from the Ethics of Military Force Committee, it could extend to 3 months. During the briefing, urgent messages arrived reporting another pirate attack in progress. The Crimson Fleet was attacking a hospital ship carrying medical supplies to plague-affected colonies in the Vega system. Parker watched in growing horror as the Security Council received real-time updates about the attack while sitting in their conference room debating proper procedures for responding to such emergencies. Should we not send ships immediately? Parker interrupted the procedural discussion. People are dying right now. The room fell silent. Primary Security Coordinator Velthana, a Zephyrian with elaborate ceremonial markings, looked genuinely shocked at the suggestion. Colonel Parker, I understand your concern, but we cannot simply dispatch military forces without following established protocols. What if we make the situation worse? What if our intervention causes collateral damage? These possibilities must be carefully evaluated before any action is taken. By the time the meeting ended 4 hours later, the hospital ship had been destroyed and its crew captured. The Security Council scheduled another meeting for the following week to discuss whether the loss of the hospital ship changed Their threat assessment parameters. Dr. Clark was making the most disturbing discoveries of all in her work with the consortium's scientific community. Despite having access to incredible resources and advanced technology from 12 different species, their research programs had become completely paralyzed by bureaucratic oversight. She spent her days attending meetings of the Scientific Research Coordination Council, where brilliant scientists presented fascinating research proposals that promptly disappeared into review processes that seemed designed to ensure nothing ever got approved. A Korthak biochemist had developed a promising treatment for the Rigelian plague that was spreading through Outer Rim colonies. But the Medical Ethics Review Board was still evaluating whether testing the treatment raised ethical concerns about experimental medicine. "How long has this plague been spreading?" Clark asked Dr. Zenthara during a break between committee meetings. "Approximately 14 months, the Veltar scientist replied. His crystal structure dimming with what Clark had learned was a sign of frustration in his species. "We estimate that over 200,000 beings have died so far, with infection rates continuing to climb. And you have a potential cure just sitting in committee review? Not just one cure, but 3 promising treatments developed by research teams from different member species. However, the Interspecies Medical Cooperation Board must first establish protocols for combining research from multiple species before any testing can begin." Clark stared at the alien scientist. 3 potential cures and none of them can be tested because you're still arguing about protocols? "The protocols exist to protect everyone," Zenthara explained, though his tone suggested he was repeating arguments he no longer believed. "We learned centuries ago that rushing to implement new treatments without proper oversight can create unexpected complications. How long do these protocol discussions typically take?" "For complex medical research involving multiple species, the standard review period is 18 to 36 months, depending on the number of ethical considerations that must be addressed." Clark felt sick. Hundreds of thousands of beings were dying from a preventable disease, while bureaucrats spent years debating the proper procedures for saving them. The consortium's obsession with avoiding risk had made them completely unable to respond to actual emergencies. During her 3rd week at the station, Clark received permission to visit the consortium's Central Research Archive, a massive database containing centuries of scientific research from all member species. What she found there shocked her even more than the committee delays. The archive was filled with incredible discoveries and breakthrough technologies that had never been implemented. Faster-than-light communication systems, advanced medical treatments, revolutionary energy sources, and dozens of other innovations sat unused because they had never completed the review process required for general distribution. This technology could solve food shortages on dozens of worlds, Clark said to archive keeper Nematlis, pointing to research on advanced agricultural techniques developed 50 years earlier. "Indeed, it shows great promise," the elderly Zephyrian agreed. However, the Committee for Agricultural Innovation determined that additional environmental impact studies were needed before implementation could be considered. 50 years ago? Time moves differently when one considers the long-term implications of change, Nematlis replied philosophically. Better to move slowly and avoid unintended consequences than to rush forward and create new problems. Clark realized that the consortium had not just become slow and inefficient. They had become actively opposed to progress itself. Their elaborate system of committees and reviews served not to ensure safety and wisdom, but to prevent any change from ever occurring. Meanwhile, Morrison had been conducting his own investigation into the consortium's history and structure. What he discovered explained everything his team had been experiencing. The 12 member species had originally formed their alliance to promote trade and cooperation, but over the centuries they had gradually added more and more oversight mechanisms to prevent conflicts and mistakes. Each new committee was created to address some past problem or prevent some potential issue. The Committee for Cultural Sensitivity was formed after a trade dispute about artistic differences. The Ethics of Technology Transfer Board was established following concerns about advanced weapons falling into the wrong hands. The environmental impact. Morrison had reached his breaking point. For 6 weeks, his team had watched the consortium debate, while emergencies unfolded across the galaxy. When urgent reports came in about the Crimson Fleet attacking another convoy near the Korthak homeworld, he made a decision that would shock everyone at the Nexus station. Captain Steve Johnson, Prepare the Liberty for immediate departure, Morrison ordered over his private communication channel. We're responding to that distress call. Johnson's voice crackled back with surprise. Sir, do we have authorization from the Consortium for Military Action? We have authorization from basic human decency, Morrison replied firmly. There are innocent people under attack right now. We're not going to sit here and watch them die while committees debate proper response procedures. Within 30 minutes, the Liberty had undocked from the Nexus station and was accelerating toward the attack site. Morrison had informed the Consortium leadership of his intentions, but he had not waited for their approval. The shocked silence from the various committee chairs spoke volumes about how unprecedented this action was in their experience. Colonel Parker coordinated the response from the Liberty's Tactical Center. The human ship was not the largest or most advanced vessel in Consortium space, but it had something the other ships lacked: a crew willing to act decisively. As they approached the battle site, Parker could see 3 pirate vessels attacking a mining convoy while the miners' escort ships held back, apparently waiting for authorization to engage. This is Colonel Parker of the Earth vessel Liberty. He broadcast on all frequencies. Crimson Fleet vessels, cease your attack immediately and withdraw from this area. The response was predictable. The pirates ignored the warning and continued their assault on the helpless mining ships. Parker had expected this outcome and was already prepared for the next phase of the operation. All weapon systems online, he ordered. Target the pirate vessel's engines and weapon systems. We want to disable them, not destroy them if possible. The battle lasted less than 20 minutes. The Liberty's crew had trained extensively in combat scenarios, and they executed their attack with precision and speed. 2 pirate ships were disabled and captured, while the third was destroyed when it attempted to ram one of the mining vessels. The entire engagement was over. Before the Consortium's emergency response, committee had even finished forming a subcommittee to evaluate the crisis to matter. Commander Zethal of the mining convoy contacted the Liberty with what sounded like amazement in his translated voice. Human vessel, we are in your debt. Our escort ships were still waiting for authorization to assist us when you arrived. Morrison took the communication personally. No debt required, Commander. We were in the area and saw people who needed help. That's what neighbors do for each other. Neighbors, Zethal repeated slowly. Yes, I remember that concept from the old days, before procedures and protocols replaced simple cooperation. The rescue operation had immediate consequences back at the Nexus station. Within hours, Morrison found himself summoned to emergency sessions with multiple committees, each demanding explanations for humanity's unauthorized military action. But something unexpected was happening. Representatives from dozens of species were quietly reaching out to the human delegation, expressing gratitude and interest in working directly with Earth. Dr. Clark was experiencing her own breakthrough, though it came from desperation rather than combat. The Rigelian plague had spread to 3 more systems while the Medical Ethics Review Board continued their debates about treatment protocols. Unable to watch more people die while committees deliberated, Clark made a decision that violated every consortium regulation she had been briefed on. Working with a small team of medical volunteers from various species, she established an unofficial treatment center in an abandoned section of the Nexus station. Using human medical techniques combined with research from consortium scientists whose work had been buried in committee reviews, she began treating plague victims who had been brought to the station. Dr. Clark, what you are doing is completely outside established protocols, warned Dr. Zenthara as he watched her work. Despite his words, the Veltar scientist was assisting with the treatments, his crystal structure glowing brighter than Clark had ever seen it. People are dying. Zenthara, Clark replied as she administered medicine to a young Zephyrian whose family had brought him to the station in desperation. I became a doctor to save lives, not to watch people suffer while bureaucrats debate ethical frameworks. Within days, word of the unofficial medical center had spread throughout the station. Beings from multiple species began arriving with sick family members, hoping for treatment that their own government's medical committees had been unable to provide. Clark's success rate was remarkable. Over 90% of plague victims who received treatment recovered completely. The Medical Ethics Review Board was outraged. They demanded that Clark cease her unauthorized medical activities immediately and report for disciplinary hearings. Clark's response was to work longer hours and treat more patients. Her defiance inspired other medical professionals throughout the consortium to begin questioning why they were letting people die to maintain bureaucratic procedures. Linda Hayes abandoned formal diplomatic channels entirely after watching the consortium spend 2 weeks debating the proper format for trade proposal submissions. Instead, she began meeting directly with merchant captains and trading representatives in the station's commercial districts, arranging practical deals that bypassed the assembly completely. The consortium leadership wants to spend 6 months evaluating whether Earth grains are culturally appropriate for Zephyrian colonies, she explained to Captain Morthek, a trader whose ships service the Outer Rim territories. But your people are facing food shortages right now. I can have grain shipments ready within a week if we skip the committees and work directly. Morthek's blue skin darkened with what Linda had learned was intense interest. You would do this without approval from the Trade Evaluation Committee? The Trade Evaluation Committee has been evaluating the same proposals for over 2 years without reaching any conclusions, Linda replied. Meanwhile, people are going hungry on 17 different worlds. I'm more interested in feeding people than in following procedures that don't work. Within days, Linda had established an underground network of direct trade relationships that completely bypassed the consortium's bureaucratic structure. Grain shipments from Earth began flowing to food-short colonies. Rare minerals moved from Outer Rim mining operations to manufacturing worlds, and medical supplies reached settlements that had been waiting months for official aid shipments. The consortium leadership was horrified by these unauthorized activities, but they faced an unexpected problem. The direct trade network was actually working. Shortages that had persisted for months were being resolved in days. Colonial populations that had been suffering under resource limitations were suddenly receiving the supplies they desperately needed. Emergency meetings were called to address what the leadership termed the human crisis, but these meetings followed the same patterns that had paralyzed the consortium for decades. Committee chairs spent hours debating proper procedures for addressing violations of proper procedures, while the unauthorized activities continued to expand and achieve results. Morrison received regular reports from his team about their various successes, but he also noticed something else happening throughout the station. Representatives from various species were quietly approaching human delegation members, asking questions about Earth's methods and expressing frustration with their own government's inability to act decisively. A young ethereal diplomat named Velaner sought out Morrison privately during one of the endless committee sessions. Captain Morrison, may I speak with you confidentially? Of course, Morrison replied, leading the gas being to a quiet area of the diplomatic quarter. I have been watching your people work for these past weeks, Velaner said through his translation device. You accomplish in hours what takes us months to even begin discussing. How do you make decisions so quickly without endless consultation and review? Morrison considered his answer carefully. We start with a simple principle. If someone needs help and we can provide it, we help them. We can discuss the details and implications later, but we don't let people suffer while we're talking. But what about unintended consequences? What about the risks of hasty action? There are always risks, Morrison acknowledged, but there are also consequences to inaction. Sometimes the risk of not acting is greater than the risk of acting imperfectly. Velanor's translated voice carried tones of wonder. Such thinking would be considered dangerously radical by my government's Philosophical Consistency Board. Maybe the problem isn't with radical thinking, Morrison suggested. Maybe the problem is with systems that consider basic problem-solving to be radical. Similar conversations were happening throughout the station, as beings from various species watched humanity's direct approach to solving problems. Many had grown up in the consortium's bureaucratic system and had never experienced what it was like to see issues addressed quickly and effectively. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable. Trade relationships that had been stalled in committee. The summons came at dawn, delivered by a formal delegation of consortium officials who had clearly been awake all night preparing their case against humanity. Morrison dressed carefully in his diplomatic uniform, knowing that this meeting would likely determine Earth's future relationship with the galaxy's most powerful trade organization, the Grand Assembly. Chamber had been reconfigured for what the consortium called a formal censure proceeding. Representatives from all 12 member species occupied their elaborate stations. while dozens of committee chairs and bureaucratic officials filled the observer sections. The chamber's translation systems hummed with activity as multiple languages prepared for what promised to be a lengthy and complex session. Morrison entered the chamber with his team, but he was not alone. As he walked down the central aisle, he noticed something that clearly surprised the consortium leadership. Representatives from dozens of species filled the visitor galleries, beings who had quietly worked with humanity over the past weeks but had never dared to speak openly about their frustrations with the system. Prime Mediator, Shelthara of the Zephyrians, called the session to order with great ceremony. Her blue skin had taken on darker tones that Morrison had learned indicated serious displeasure. This proceeding has been convened to address the serious violations of established protocols committed by the human delegation. Captain Morrison, you and your team stand accused of unauthorized military action, unsanctioned medical intervention, and violation of approved trade procedures. Morrison remained standing as the charges were read. Each accusation was technically accurate. They had engaged the Crimson Fleet without authorization, established medical facilities without committee approval, and arranged trade agreements outside official channels. Under consortium law, any of these violations could result in immediate expulsion from all diplomatic proceedings. How do you respond to these charges? Shelthara asked formally. Guilty as charged, Morrison replied simply. His answer sent shocked murmurs through the chamber. Diplomatic defendants were expected to offer complex justifications and procedural challenges, not straightforward admissions of guilt. You admit to violating our established protocols? I admit to saving lives while your committees debated proper procedures for saving lives, Morrison clarified. I admit to feeding hungry people while your boards evaluated the cultural implications of preventing starvation. I admit to stopping pirates while your councils discussed authorization protocols for stopping pirates. The chamber erupted in confused conversation. Shelthara called for order, but Morrison was not finished speaking. For 6 weeks, my team has watched this organization debate emergencies while people died, he continued. We have seen brilliant scientists with cures for deadly plagues wait years for permission to save lives. We have watched pirates attack innocent civilians while military commanders asked committees for permission to defend them. We have seen starving populations ignored, while trade officials formed subcommittees to study the philosophical implications of food distribution. Fleet Commander Thexal of the Korthok interrupted angrily. You humans think you understand our methods, but you lack the wisdom that comes from centuries of careful governance. Your hasty actions could have created unforeseen consequences. What consequences? Colonel Parker stood to respond. The consequence of saving Commander Zethal's mining convoy? The consequence of preventing the Crimson Fleet from capturing more innocent beings? The consequence of giving miners a chance to return to their families instead of being sold into slavery? The consequence of acting without proper authorization, Thexal replied stiffly. The consequence of setting dangerous precedents for military intervention. The consequence of undermining established chain of command protocols. Dr. Clark rose from her seat before Morrison could stop her. I want to understand something, Fleet Commander. While you were debating authorization protocols, 17 more convoys were attacked by the same pirates. How many people died waiting for your proper authorization? Thexal's mandibles clicked with irritation. Those regrettable losses were unavoidable given the complexity of military authorization procedures. Unavoidable? Clark's voice carried both incredulity and anger. I have saved over 300 lives in the past 3 weeks using treatments that your Medical Ethics Review Board has been evaluating for over 2 years. Were those deaths unavoidable too? Counselor Vexmore of the insectoid Korthok spoke up with what sounded like wounded dignity. Dr. Clark, your unauthorized medical interventions violated numerous safety protocols. You administered treatments without proper oversight or long-term impact studies. Those treatments saved the lives of your own people, Clark shot back, including your nephew, who would have died from the Rigelian plague if I had waited for your ethics committee to finish their review. The chamber fell silent. Vexmore's personal connection to Clark's medical work was news to most of the assembly, and his criticism of the doctor who had saved his family member seemed particularly hollow. Linda Hayes stood to address the trade accusations. I want to ask the assembly a simple question. Why do you have a committee for agricultural trade evaluation that has been evaluating the same grain shipment proposal for 28 months? Trade Coordinator Nomella of the Veltar answered defensively. Complex trade relationships require thorough analysis to prevent market disruptions and ensure cultural compatibility. People are starving on Kepler Prime while you analyze cultural compatibility, Linda replied. I arranged grain shipments that arrived last week and prevented a famine. What market disruption did that cause? The disruption of bypassing established procedures, Nomella replied. But her crystal structure was flickering, with what Morrison had learned indicated uncertainty. As the formal accusations continued, Morrison noticed something significant happening in the observer galleries. Representatives from various species were quietly talking among themselves, and their body language suggested growing agitation with the proceedings. Many of them had worked directly with humanity over the past weeks, and had seen firsthand what could be accomplished when people focused on solving problems instead of following procedures. The turning point came when Dr. Clark received an urgent message on her communication device. She read it quickly, then stood up abruptly. I apologize for interrupting these important proceedings, she said with barely controlled sarcasm. But I have just received word that a massive asteroid field is now 12 days away from impacting 3 inhabited systems in the Vega sector. This is the same asteroid field that I reported to the Assembly 6 weeks ago. Prime Mediator Kelthera looked confused. Yes, the Astronomical Threat Assessment Committee has been evaluating the situation. They are expected to present their preliminary findings next month. Next month? Clark stared at the mediator. The asteroids will impact in 12 days. Millions of people need to be evacuated immediately. The evacuation protocols require extensive coordination between multiple agencies, explained Emergency Coordinator Felthera. The Committee for Population Relocation must first assess available resources, determine suitable temporary housing locations, and establish proper procedures for interspecies refugee management. This process typically requires 4 to 6 months for full implementation. Morrison felt something snap inside him. The consortium leadership was calmly discussing 6-month planning processes for a disaster that would occur in less than 2 weeks. They were not incompetent or evil, but they had become so trapped in their own bureaucratic systems that they had lost the ability to recognize the difference between normal administrative tasks and life-threatening emergencies. 4 to 6 months, Morrison repeated slowly, for a disaster that happens in 12 days. Emergency situations require even more careful planning than routine operations, Felthara replied earnestly. The potential for mistakes increases dramatically when proper procedures are abbreviated. Morrison looked around the chamber at the assembled representatives of 12 advanced civilizations. These were not stupid beings, but they had created a system that made intelligent action impossible. They had become so afraid of making mistakes that they preferred guaranteed failure to the risk of imperfect success. I want to make sure I understand the situation correctly, Morrison said formally. The consortium has identified a massive threat to 3 inhabited star systems. You have had 6 weeks to plan a response. The disaster will occur in 12 days, and your solution is to form a committee that will spend 6 months developing evacuation procedures. That is a somewhat simplified description of the process, but essentially accurate, Felthera confirmed. Morrison made a decision that would change everything. He had reached the point where he could no longer pretend that this system could be reformed or improved. The consortium was not just inefficient, but actively harmful to the welfare of the galaxy's inhabitants. Prime Mediator Kelthera, I want to make humanity's position completely clear, Morrison announced. Earth gives the consortium 72 hours to authorize immediate evacuation operations for the threatened systems. If you cannot take decisive action to save millions of lives within 3 days, humanity will withdraw from all consortium affairs permanently. The chamber erupted in. The 72 hours passed exactly as Morrison had expected them to. The consortium leadership spent the entire time forming committees to discuss how to respond to ultimatums, creating subcommittees to evaluate the precedent of responding to ultimatums, and establishing review boards to determine whether ultimatums violated diplomatic protocols. Not a single evacuation ship was dispatched to the threatened systems. Morrison stood in his quarters aboard the Liberty, watching the final committee session through the station's communication network. The Committee for Unusual Diplomatic Situations had finally convened after spending 2 days debating whether ultimatums qualified as unusual diplomatic situations. Their conclusion was that they needed to form an additional committee to study the formation of committees in response to ultimatums. "Captain, we have confirmation from all human personnel," reported Captain Steve Johnson from the Liberty's bridge. "Everyone is ready for departure on your signal." Morrison activated his personal communication device and sent a coded message that had been prepared weeks earlier. Throughout consortium space, every human representative, trade official, and diplomatic staff member received the same simple instruction: pack everything and prepare for immediate departure. The response was swift and coordinated. At research stations, trade posts, and diplomatic facilities across dozens of worlds, human personnel began shutting down their operations and heading for the nearest spaceports. The evacuation had been planned carefully during the weeks of growing frustration with consortium bureaucracy. But Morrison was not leaving quietly. He had one final message to deliver, and he wanted to make sure it reached everyone who needed to hear it. "Attention all beings throughout consortium space," Morrison broadcast on all communication frequencies. "This is Captain Jake Morrison of Earth. 72 hours ago, I informed the consortium leadership that millions of lives were at risk from an approaching asteroid field. I asked for immediate evacuation operations to save those lives. The consortium's response was to form a committee to study how to respond to requests for life-saving action." Morrison paused to let that information sink in before continuing. "Humanity is withdrawing from all consortium affairs effective immediately, but we are not abandoning our neighbors. Any individual, any ship, any world that wants to work together to solve real problems instead of debating proper procedures for solving problems is welcome to join us." The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Communication channels across the galaxy lit up with responses from beings who had watched the consortium's paralysis with growing frustration for years. Captain Steve Johnson reported that the Liberty was being contacted by ships from 17 different species, all requesting permission to join humanity's departure from consortium space. Dr. Clark received hundreds of messages from medical professionals throughout the galaxy asking to join her. Direct action approach to treating the plague. Scientists whose research had been buried in committee reviews for decades requested transfers to human-controlled facilities where their work could actually be implemented. Colonel Parker found himself coordinating with military officers from multiple species who were tired of watching pirates operate freely while their commanders waited for authorization to stop them. Commander Zethel of the mining convoy that humanity had rescued sent a message offering his entire fleet's services to any organization willing to actually protect innocent civilians. Linda Hayes was contacted by traders and merchants from dozens of worlds who wanted to participate in direct commerce without bureaucratic oversight. The underground trade network she had established was rapidly expanding as more beings chose practical cooperation over procedural compliance. The mass exodus from consortium space was unlike anything in galactic history. Entire research teams abandoned their projects rather than wait years for permission to save lives. Military units transferred their loyalty to commanders who would actually give orders. Merchants closed their consortium-regulated businesses to join free trade networks that prioritized results over procedures. Prime Mediator Salthara made a desperate attempt to stop the departures by calling for emergency sessions of the full assembly. But even these emergency sessions became bogged down in debates about proper procedures for emergency sessions. By the time they had formed a committee to address the exodus, most of the people they wanted to stop had already left consortium space entirely. The transformation was rapid and dramatic. Morrison established humanity's new diplomatic headquarters aboard a massive space station called New Geneva, positioned at the edge of former consortium territory. Within days, representatives from over 40 species had requested permission to establish offices there. The differences between New Geneva and the old Nexus station were immediately apparent to everyone who visited. Decisions that would have taken months in the consortium were made in hours. Trade agreements were negotiated and signed in single meetings. Military responses to piracy were authorized and executed within hours of receiving distress calls. Dr. Clark announced the complete eradication of the Rigelian plague within 6 months of leaving consortium space. Working with researchers from multiple species in an environment where results mattered more than procedures, they had developed and distributed effective treatments throughout the affected regions. Colonel Parker established the Galactic Security Cooperative, a military alliance that responded to threats with immediate action rather than committee deliberation. Piracy rates dropped to historic lows as word spread that attacks on civilian vessels would be met with swift and decisive retaliation. Linda Hayes reported that trade volumes in the new network had increased by 400% compared to consortium levels, when merchants could negotiate directly with each other without bureaucratic interference. Commerce flourished in ways that had not been seen for centuries. The asteroid crisis that had triggered Morrison's ultimatum became a perfect example of the differences between the two systems. While the consortium continued to debate evacuation procedures, the New Geneva Alliance organized and executed a complete population transfer from the threatened systems in 8 days. Over 12 million beings were relocated to safety using ships and resources from dozens of different species working together without bureaucratic oversight. When the asteroids finally impacted the evacuated systems, the consortium was still in committee sessions discussing the proper protocols for asteroid impact assessment. The old system did not disappear immediately. The Galactic Trade Consortium continued to exist, still meeting regularly at the Nexus station to debate the same issues they had been discussing for decades. But their sessions were increasingly empty as member species chose to ignore the consortium in favor of direct cooperation with each other. The few beings who remained loyal to the consortium found themselves trapped in an ever-shrinking circle of bureaucratic paralysis. Their last major debate involved the proper pronunciation of the word committee, and lasted 8 months before being referred to a subcommittee for further study. 5 years after humanity's departure, Morrison stood on the observation deck of New Geneva Station, watching construction ships from 30 different species working together to expand the facility. The scene would have been impossible under consortium rules, which required separate committees to oversee every aspect of multi-species cooperation. "Admiral Morrison," called a familiar voice. Morrison turned to see Velinor, the young ethereal diplomat who had once asked him about human decision-making methods. The gas being now served as New Geneva's coordinator for interspecies affairs, a position that would have required 7 different committees under the old system. "The Zephyrian Council has requested asylum from the consortium," Velinor reported. "They say they're tired of watching their people's needs ignored while bureaucrats debate proper procedures for addressing needs." Morrison nodded. This was becoming a common pattern as more species realized that they could choose effectiveness over procedure. "Approved. Set them up with facilities and get them connected to our trade and security networks." "Right away, Admiral," Velinor replied, then paused. "It's remarkable how much can be accomplished when people focus on solving problems instead of debating proper methods for approaching problems." Morrison smiled as he watched ships from dozens of different species working together in perfect coordination. The consortium never understood that talking about doing something and actually doing something are 2 completely different activities. They got so good at talking that they forgot how to act. The final entry in Morrison's personal log that evening captured the transformation perfectly. "They expected us to become like them, trapped in their endless circles of talk. They never imagined we would simply walk away and build something better." Sometimes the most powerful diplomatic statement is not what you say, but when you stop saying it and start doing it instead. The galaxy is a much better place when good people are free to do good work, without asking permission from committees that exist to prevent work from being done.